What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Thomas, bringing you the latest edition of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I'm here to tell you that the Ultimate Fighting Championship announced that UFC 213, which is set to take place July 8th in T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas, Nevada, it was the stage for International Fight Week, has undergone a bit of a shakeup. And the news today announced by Dana White himself, the UFC president, is that Cody Garbrandt versus TJ Dillashaw is now off the card, and Amanda Nunes and Valentina Shevchenko will be the main event of that fight card. But more importantly, news about the UFC middleweight division was announced today as an interim title fight between Yoel Romero and Robert Whittaker will be had on July 8th at in Las Vegas, Nevada, at the T-Mobile Arena. So there's a lot of moving parts here. Obviously, the big news is that Cody Garbrandt, his back injury was far too severe to take on TJ Dillashaw, and now TJ Dillashaw is setting his sights on the UFC flyweight champion, Demetrious Mighty Mouse Johnson, who is the 125-pound champion. So that could actually, the injury to Cody Garbrandt could delay the prospects of TJ Dillashaw ever fighting for the UFC bantamweight title again, depending on whether or not he does fight Demetrious Johnson and beats him. If he fights Demetrious Johnson and wins, I would assume that Demetrious Johnson would get an immediate title shot, being that he's been the champion for quite some time. So it could kind of change the trajectory of TJ Dillashaw's career, this one injury to Cody Garbrandt. It's very amazing how it really does take two fighters to tango, and how one injury can change the whole affect the whole career of the other fighter who was not even injured. That could very well happen. Also, the news that was announced where Amanda Nunes will take on Valentina Shevchenko, that was obviously going to happen July 8th as the co-main, but that is now promoted as the main event of that fight card. Pretty big news in the career of Amanda Nunes. She's going to be on an International Fight Week stage on the pay-per-view event for July 8th versus a fighter that she has fought a very tough battle with once before in Valentina Shevchenko, a fighter that they have very bad blood between the two of them, so I'm anticipating that will be a great fight, but more so a change of pace for the middleweight division, where Yoel Romero will now take on Robert Whittaker for the UFC interim title. Whittaker is coming off that huge victory over Jacare Souza, a fight that it was on UFC on FS1, or on UFC on Fox, with Demetrious Johnson headlining versus Wilson Hayes, and Robert Whittaker practically stole the show, winning that fight in a huge upset fashion. Now, Whittaker really has a realistic chance of beating Yoel Romero. I want to make that very clear. Most people are so high on Yoel Romero, they think that Yoel Romero will run right through Robert Whittaker. I don't think that's the case. The stand-up striking ability of Robert Whittaker is very, very in tune right now, and his takedown defense, Jacare Souza could not get Robert Whittaker to the mat. I know Yoel Romero has a fine pedigree in wrestling, but Jacare is a great clinch fighter and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. So I was very impressed with Robert Whittaker's performance in that fight. Easily one of the biggest upsets of the year so far, and I think he can get past Yoel Romero. Really, this fight, though, in the case of Yoel Romero and Yoel Romero and Robert Whittaker, this is a fight that can very well change the outlook of the future for the UFC middleweight division. It was widely reported by Dana White and many MMA outlets that the GSP versus Michael Bisping middleweight title fight was off, where Bisping, the champion, will take on GSP. And it was off because Michael Bisping has not faced a fighter since October of 2016. So he's had quite the layoff. But the UFC already obligated themselves to that fight, even though there was no date. There was a press conference. So they're not really pulling a fight off of a date, but they are pulling a fight out of the fans' minds, which is something that the UFC tends not to do, or tries really, really hard not to do. So for the UFC to do that and then allow, Bisping, not allow Bisping the chance to get a payday, a realistic payday, his first realistic payday in his entire career, I was really hoping to see that fight not only for Bisping but for GSP. Now, there's two sides to this. Does the Yoel Romero fight with Robert Whittaker end the chance of Bisping versus GSP, or does it help the chance of Bisping versus GSP? I actually think it's both. It's both in terms of the fact that it's bad that they're setting up an interim title fight, because usually the title fight winner does face the champion next. Very soon after. On the other hand, it's good because Michael Bisping can't fight anyway until October, November. So typically, depending on how the Robert Whittaker-Yoel Romero fight goes, if one or both fighters are heavily injured or damaged and the fight is a war, they will not be allowed to fight for the next 3 to 4 months. So, maybe even up to 6 months, maybe even up to a year, depending on how much of a war it could possibly be, which it very well could be. So Bisping could still get his money fight with GSP, and GSP could still get the opportunity to fight Michael Bisping in a UFC middleweight title fight. There's so many moving parts to this UFC middleweight division. Realistically, I was really hoping for this Bisping-GSP fight, and I want to really look at the future that the UFC has in front of us here in 2017. Now that this Garbrandt-Dillashaw fight is off, really the only fights that are set in stone that are big fights are DC and Jones and Nunes and Shevchenko. And realistically, Nunes and Shevchenko is not really a big fight to drive big money pay-per-views, into the cash flow, so to speak, of the UFC. They're going to have to maybe even stack that card a little bit more heavily, being that Nunes and Shevchenko are on it. Nunes is not really a pay-per-view draw yet. So realistically, the only fight that is realistically a big gatekeeper for the UFC is DC versus John Jones 2, and that is a fight that has been scheduled 5 or 6 times. So if this fight falls through in late July, we could have some serious problems with the UFC summer of 2017. As I mentioned earlier, one fight that's being talked about is Demetrius Johnson versus TJ Dillashaw. I got realistic questions as to whether TJ Dillashaw could cut down from 135 to 125. Do I think he can do it? Probably, but that's a lot of weight, usually for a guy that walks around at 150, 155, 160 pounds. This is not a guy that is an easy weight cut at 135, let alone at 125. 10 pounds is a big difference. I'm really going to go out on a limb here and say, moving forward, the fights that the UFC has to offer for the summer of 2017 are not nearly as good as what they were in 2016 or 2015. Looking at the MMA landscape, Bellator is actually offering more exciting fan-friendly fights than what the UFC is currently for the 2017 summer. Chael Sonnen and Vanderlei Silva, Fedor Emelianenko versus Matt Mitrione, Diego Lima versus Lorenz Larkin, Michael Chandler versus Brett Primus. Those 4 fights, and obviously Phil Davis versus Ryan Bader, those are all great fights. And the UFC, in terms of their pay-per-view, have not really stacked the deck like they have in years past. They don't have the star power. And really, I want to look at, the future. Like I said, UFC 212, you have Jose Aldo versus Max Holloway. I don't know how, well that will sell, being that the situation of that featherweight division, it's a champion versus champion fight. Neither one of them is considered the champion. Just currently, they're the 2 best guys in the UFC featherweight division. In terms of UFC fights in the future, the fight nights the UFC FS1 fight nights are actually better than some of the pay-per-views, where Gustafsson is fighting Glover Teixeira, Derek Lewis is fighting Mark Hunt, Holly Holm is fighting Betch Correia. There are some better fights on those cards than there is on the pay-per-views, and the UFC is a pay-per-view business. June 25th, Michael Chiesa takes on Kevin Lee. It'll be very interesting to see how that pans out. You have BJ Penn versus Dennis Seaver finally, and Tim Boesch versus Johnny Hendricks. That's a decent UFC Fight Night event, and that's probably better than some of the pay-per-views that have been out that will be, in July or August or even September. Who knows what is going to be brought to the table? Michael Johnson versus Justin Gaethje from the World Series of Fighting. There's really not a lot of decent events coming up, and it's very disappointing to say that. UFC 213, I had high hopes for it, but I'm not really at a point right now where I'm really pumped up about it. I know that the fight with Robbie Lawler and Donald Cerrone will be a barn burner, but I wanted to read something that someone wrote on the Wikipedia page that I just came across. Robert Whittaker, a.k.a. Bobby Knuckles, is set to light up Yoel Romero in an interim middleweight championship fight. Yoel earned this shot from years of steroid abuse, whilst Bobby obtained his from not being a cat like Luke Rockhold and actually being an active, winning fighter. I'm going to screenshot that because that is hilarious. The fight card right now, Amanda Nunes versus Valentina Shevchenko, Robert Whittaker versus Yoel Romero, Lawler versus Cerrone, Verdum versus Overeem, Pettis versus Miller. Obviously, a great card. It just doesn't have the drawing power that I would hope in terms of a main event. I think it's a great stage for Amanda Nunes, but it is pretty crazy how the UFC Fight Night events seem to be picking up more steam in 2017 than they have in years past. And John Jones versus Daniel Cormier at the Honda Center in Anaheim is scheduled for July 29th. And right now, the only two fights that are on that card are Daniel Cormier versus John Jones and Doo Ho Choi versus Andre Touchy-Feely. So what could they put on that card as a co-main? Only time will tell. But I'm just not really enamored with the lineups that these UFC cards have for the summer of 2017. I think that the Yoel Romero fight and the Whittaker fight was the right decision. They needed to do an interim title fight, but I hope that Bisping and GSP still do battle in September, October, or at the worst, November. And realistically, it would fit the timeline perfect for Michael Bisping. He has a devastating knee injury that he is slowly recovering from, so I don't think he's ready to fight right away. And I also think that that fight would bode well for his payday, for his career. He deserves that payday, and GSP offers that to him. So sometimes the game of fighting is not always about who deserves it. There's situations like this where Michael Bisping has dedicated his career to the UFC over 10 years, as has GSP. So on the GSP side of things, he gets a shot at the UFC middleweight belt, joining the elite company of one of only 4 fighters to have 2 belts in 2 different weight classes. And Michael Bisping, on the other hand, gets an opportunity to get a big payday. Yoel Romero and Robert Whittaker can duke it out and wait for the winner. Take care. That was the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I'm Ryan Thomas. Thank you for tuning in. You can check me out on Facebook.com/Thomas Take and also on YouTube.com. Type in the Thomas Take Sports Podcast and click subscribe.